listening to the INL podcast with Graeme Bradshaw and Philip Watkins, brought to you by Integrated Nutraceuticals Limited, Hong Kong. We're grateful to have you with us. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Hi there, Philip Watkins, Naturopath and Director of Education here at INL. I'd like to welcome you back to another episode of the INL podcast. It's great to have you with us. In this episode, I'm joined again by INL's and IMI's founder, Graeme Bradshaw. With over 32 years in practice, Graeme is an experienced and respected naturopath, homeopath, medical herbalist and nutritionist. He applies his wealth of clinical experience, knowledge and extensive postgraduate training in diagnostics and functional medicine to treat the root cause for a vast array of health concerns. In this episode, we are building on the previous episode's discussion around immunity towards the considerations needed to help patients recover and convalesce post-infection. We cover a lot of ground in this episode, but a key theme from Graeme is the importance of considering the mitochondrial energy system and how the cell danger response dampens the body's ability to create its own energy, and how to apply natural medicine to intervene in this process so that we can help people get back on track after infection and recover well. So without further ado, let's get started. Welcome to another episode of the INL podcast for 2020. My name is Philip Watkins and I'm joined today by Graeme Bradshaw, founder of IMI and INL, for another great episode today. We're going to be talking about a few different things. The big subject for us today will actually be around post-viral syndrome and some of the things that we think might be coming up for us in the future of this year, which we can both agree is a pretty unprecedented time. I'd like to thank you for joining us, and Graeme, thanks for being here.
I enjoy our conversations.
Yeah, me too. I think we've already done 2 episodes off air this morning, but look, I wanted to start off by asking you one of the more interesting questions I think starting to come up globally now is, okay, we seem to be getting somewhat of a handle at least on the management of COVID-19 and these types of things. But what I wanted to talk about today is an interesting subject that we've been talking about a fair bit, which is just exactly what do we do now? You know, the really interesting part of the SARS research in Toronto, when they had a small outbreak there, was that some of the people that were experiencing the SARS symptoms there had a post-viral syndrome for up to 3 years post their infection. And well, have you heard anything more about that type of thing, or do you feel as if
Yeah, we can expect people to have a post-viral effect from this. It's a very intense viral infection. It's more intense than most, isn't it? I mean, we don't hear too many people with, let's say, Epstein-Barr virus dying from the inflammation, right?
Right.
So, I mean, and yet they can come along with this post-viral syndrome, and there's many others as well. Chronic infections, and it may be, and we still don't know for sure, but there's certainly some indication that this virus might resurface in people like chronic, monodots. It can resurface when people are fatigued just from their stresses in life. So there are something like about 10% of some of the retests that they've done in South Korea showing up that people have got positive again. So there's some hint that we might be having that kind of event with this particular virus. And because there's such an intense amount of inflammation going on in the lungs, and the immune system actually, to some extent, attacking or aggravating the actual problem by this cytokine storm, then you've also got this basic inflammatory process that's often driving most illness to quench. Even if it doesn't go on to a post-viral, we've still got that factor to help people get over. And a few of our situation in Hong Kong is a bit different to most places. A few of us, more like the bigger doctor surgeries, are actually finding they're referring active COVID state patients. But a few of us are really meeting. It's only 1,000 something in Hong Kong, as we know. So to a large extent, just winding back a little bit in the conversation, what can we do given that we've got COVID out there for the next couple of years, or let's say, year and a half until there's a decent amount of herd immunity. What can we do to minimise the risk of those patients who would like to travel and who might end up with COVID in that period? And to me, with functional medicine, you're always dealing with all those predispositions that lead to more inflammation. It's just a pretty straightforward equation in most cases, so that we know for sure that obesity plays a big role, metabolic syndrome, diabetes. Well, again, we might say, diabetics are a bit harder to manage, but gosh, there's a lot of people who are obese and have got metabolic syndrome, and they do see functional medicine practitioners like ourselves. And, they're under some kind of chronic stress. They probably have a bit of a gut problem like half the patients who walk in have, which is adding to their inflammation. They might have food reactions, and many of them have some kind of detox defects, and that leads to another whole thing if we go out the world of chronic fatigue syndrome in our conversation. So what I'm getting at is there's a lot of people that we want to kind of scare a bit about, actually it's not cool having a BMI over 27. You might have kind of a lifestyle choice factor and gotten used to it, but actually you've just noticed that people can die because of that, and it's like, pay attention. It's a big tap on the shoulder, and let's work on that while you're here. So I think that's the bulk of the people we can help, is to minimise their risks, so that they don't head off over this hill of excess inflammation if they would get the infection, and bring them down into a low level of inflammation, in other words, good health, wellness. So I think that's probably the bulk of people we can help, but then we are going to see these few strays that come in to our practices over the next couple of years, and they put their symptoms down to, I'm not well since I had that COVID flu, so I could say I'm knocked out. And what are we going to do with those folks?
Well, what do you think? Something I've seen some interesting cases recently in that they've been tested, and it's very clear that the tests came up negative. Yet the symptoms that they've experienced are very, 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 very similar. And have you seen anything like that?
At the moment, no. I haven't had any close shaves or COVID patients, so everything that I say has to be given that factor into it. So there's
I think the same could be said for both of us, right?
And most people in practice, because actually most patients suffer at home. Normally in our winters here, we have plenty of people with flu who come in with very, very similar symptoms, and we're quite used to treating them in the way that we do, and it's a little less straightforward than a medical model where you have to have an exact diagnosis and an exact drug treatment. As we're talking about immunity here at this stage of a conversation, there's a good number of things that we can do to both, create a better immunity in the first place, and that goes beyond just getting people to reduce their sugars and obesity. But vitamin D is pretty critical, probiotics. We've talked about these kind of things already. We won't stress that too much. But when it comes to the inflamed stage, our herbal formulas like Armour Force, the ones that have andrographis and echinacea in them, they do manage this sort of cytokine storm factor, and we like to use quercetin in that stage if we would have patients come to see us with this type of symptoms from what it might be flu. In most years, this year we hardly see even the flu patients, right?
They think that that's the mask,
for sure,
the mask thing,
for sure,
right?
the whole hygiene answer to viruses that are, through the spittle and sneezing and so on.
They said that the flu season here had been reduced down to 21 days.
Yeah, I saw, I think I mentioned this in the last conversation with you, I saw some South China Morning Post news reports in the first week of January where we'd already had 7 people die. And there's, published notes on the flu season that come in from East Asia and different regions. And it's like the third week of January, flu just about disappeared from those numbers, across East Asia as everybody donned their mask. So great. So we probably saved 150 lives from the flu virus.
Which is 10% of the people who have been infected with COVID,
so
right?
not a bad start on public well-being. So yeah, but coming towards the topic again of what do you do? So high doses of quercetin. You and I have been exchanging quite a bit on berberine, and there's good amount of research, and maybe we should identify why. berberine and quercetin are both able to bring down these NF-kappa Bs, IL-6s, TNF-alphas. And they're the critical ones that end up with producing so much of the inflammation that ends in the cytokine storms, them being the cytokines themselves. And also another extract called bakelin, which comes from basil skullcap. And one of the formulas that we've used here a ton in previous viral upper respiratory tract and lung infections is the one called Viricon. It's very good from Vital Nutrients. And it has all of those things, although you could say you've got to add the quercetin on top of that to get the full lot. And so, just quenching that inflammatory response, and we've always seen very good responses to those. They're very popular. In Australia, Armour Force is one of the things the public goes and rushes to get. It's well known for hot coughs, if you like, bronchitis, which without much phlegm and all that irritation.
I think you brought up an interesting point earlier with the notion of the vulnerability in the general population of things like obesity, inflammation, metabolic diseases, cardiovascular kind of risks, with high blood pressure and or other things along those lines.
That's metabolic syndrome, isn't it? I mean, that's what it is. It has all of those components.
It just shows you that the foundation of which these things kind of threaten. So as soon as you get some form of intense kind of challenge to the body, when you have metabolic syndrome or you have some of these particular risk factors, the period of time between when you can take action and when you can't is actually really, really short.
Yeah, that's true.
And
that's true.
It's interesting in that all of these things are globally now, I believe, things that we need to consider. And I think the virus itself and the way that the pandemic is spread over the world, we're seeing a very universal kind of cracks in the foundations in relation to exactly what all this means for society in general.
It's kind of a pity the messaging hasn't been more about, hey, reduce your risk. It's not just about the hygiene message. I think governments have a really good opportunity here to, put out health messages about, these things do create risk for you. To lose weight, to reduce, to manage your predispositions, in other words, with more than just some drugs. Of course, as functional medicine practitioners, that's how we prefer to go about it.
Don't have a supplement deficiency.
No, and then there's things like berberine. Berberine is quite a remarkable herb because it does manage metabolic syndrome extremely well. It lowers cholesterol. Apart from its anti-inflammatory activities, it's somewhat really antidepressant, partly through the anti-inflammatory activities. It's a herb that has a massive amount of functions, and even put it head-to-head with metformin. The conclusion in that study was it's slightly better because it has somewhat less side effects. So it's an excellent herb to help with people predisposed to diabetes or in the realm of metabolic syndrome and so on. Yeah, Phil, and just the one little mention there, in that list of things you mentioned, we don't tend to include fatty liver in metabolic syndrome, but yet it's highly correlated and they overlap tremendously. And, half the people by the time they got to 50, half the kind of clients we see have got fatty liver. And so that's a part of the same picture. It's already predisposed, it's right at the edge, the inflammation's wrong. And you'll see things like their ALT and their GGTs, maybe halfway up their so-called healthy range. But actually, my look at that so-called healthy range for those liver function tests is any GGT over 25 is already high. You've lost your glutathione, and that's a huge predisposition to the rest of the things that go wrong, like toxic exposures and viruses, and not having the defense you need in your mitochondria to those. And in the ALT, let's say take that one. Again, if you go very far into the range, even 20 or 25 again, in that range, you're already having destruction of liver cells going on. It's like, it's already happening, before you start to get to the pathology. And this is the distinction between functional medicine and pathological medicine. Is yes, by the time you're getting up into the 50s and 60s with those numbers, you've got a pathology in your liver, and you're probably well on the way to whatever it might be.
It's a longer road home.
It's the functional part where you start to see that stress is where we need to take action with our glutathiones and our, corrections of the diet to reduce the carbohydrate and fat load, or the unhealthy fat load, all that stuff.
Have you seen a correlation with some of those GGT numbers and GSTM1 gene deletions as well? Do you find that, and I think we may have touched on this previously, but I think, and just as a side note, if you want to learn more about our recommendations for immunity, just go to the last episode of this podcast, because we spent a good 45 minutes on it. With the GSTM1 deletion and how that almost precurses people, are we now seeing the future of natural medicine's role moving into prevention, as far as do we now see the reality of what prevention now looks like for people? And I think what you've brought up with the liver especially is that fatty liver is actually taking over from diabetes. And that's to beat diabetes in prevalence is crazy.
Nearly always the predisposition is there, and the GGT in the liver going high is a very good marker. Well, more literally, it's a marker for the lack of cysteine, and N-acetylcysteine inferred in that is that produces the GGT response. Mm-hmm. So you're running out. Where's your cysteine going? When it's going into your glutathione, so your glutathione is deficient or depleting. When that is going off, then there's this methylglycol. Sometimes in the reports, the researchers always just put it down as Mg, so you don't have to use the word. Anyway, that is one of the protective nutrients that has to be recycled with glutathione.
Right.
Once it builds up, you become insulin resistant.
It's crazy, isn't it?
So it's like there's a whole stream of research going on at the moment. Is this methylglycol? I'm not quite confident in how I'm saying it, glycol or glycol or whatever, Mg, which is depleted by a lack of glutathione being able to get rid of it. So this insulin response comes very closely along this line related to the liver. And so then what's causing the depletion in the glutathione? It can be this genetics of the deletion. And it's very common. 40% of people don't make enough of the glutathione owing to that, which is all very fine if you're living as a peasant, which is, how come it can become, so prevalent in our society, but it's not a good one for a polluted society.
No, it's not, is it? And it's these are the types of things that I find actually really interesting about how to potentially reconsider our role as natural medicine practitioners. And I think a lot of our listeners are also in their own healthcare modalities who are now very much in a situation where they actually have to say, well, do I have a new role to play now post all of this? Because are we now saying that we have to run broader testing to actually assess people's risks towards this kind of thing? And how do we go about educating people in relation to do that? How do we work with other modalities potentially to enhance this process as well? Because it does seem to me, and you touched on this a little bit earlier, that minimum we've got another 18 months of this. As far as the phasing and waving, or at least that's what I'm calling it at the moment, and that we're getting waves and phasing back the containment or phasing forward the containment. Do you have any comments on that, and if you've had any thoughts about these new things that we may actually have to start really concentrating on? You touched on obesity, you've touched on the metabolic disease. Is there anything else post-viral now that we need to start considering for people?
Let's go into the post-viral side of it a bit, because that after all is the main theme of what we wanted to talk about today, and I think that's a good preamble. I guess just the last thing to say before we end the preamble part is that there is a hypothalamic and limbic response. The amygdala can be highly activated, and when we start talking about the stress to the cells that viruses can cause, we start talking about electron steal, and we start talking about the mitochondria. Now, I might have introduced a few terms there that people are not yet all that familiar with, and it comes out of the work by Navio in the cell danger response. But just to hook back before we dive into the sort of biochemic angle of that, back at the macro scale, our brains and the hypothalamus and chronic stress. Now, many people have undergone traumatic life incidents as a child, and that has a massive effect and a permanent effect. And so reactivation of stress responses is much higher. And we know there's a bunch of different things that happen in the brain as a result. Methylation is different in the brain. The amygdala is more highly activated. The pro-inflammatory response is kicked off by excess cortisol for too long. Then the insulin starts going high, because it's a kind of a race between cortisol and insulin, and so one goes up, the other comes to join it, so you start to get that weird effect of, even though there's corticosteroids in the system, you're still getting a pro-inflammatory effect if it's chronic, and they're kind of like, aren't steroids all about, yeah, short term, yeah, but long term, no, it starts to fire backwards. So all of that, probably enough about the predispositions, and of course when we listen to our patients who have CFS, they have often got some other major life event, like a loss of a loved one, or an affair in the relationship, or some sort of big trigger that knocks them back. And again, if they have those more early life experiences, that can be a much bigger trigger for them. So look, what I'm talking about there is the whole brain angle of how you can go into chronic fatigue is substantial. It's one of the ways you get there, and it's very legitimate. The studies are very profound on it. So it's like, so it turns out the mitochondria are sensitive to all sorts of environmental factors, including the stress that our brains have experienced is one of the ways they go down. And then there's the methylation and detoxification issues that lead to ADHD and the autistic spectrum, and in the younger ones, and then in the older ones it leads to some of the Alzheimer's and so on. Parkinson's disease is the other one I want to get out. But in general, what we're saying is that that whatever way it's ending up, that there's chronic inflammatory response in the system down at the mitochondrial level, that's where a lot of the damage that leads to chronic fatigue is occurring, because the mitochondria, after all, are the energy production units of every cell, thousands in most cells. So that's, if the mitochondria are going down with whatever it is, whether it's a viral attack, or whether it's a heavy metal or pollutant load attack, or a chronic stress response, they can all be factors that are relevant. And I might say, here in Hong Kong, one of the most predominant things that stops our patients from getting well, a couple of us here have kind of made the conclusion, if the patient's not well, we do a mycotoxins test and discover that, hey, they've got a mouldy house, and that's what's screwing up their mitochondria. So, Phil, your point about looking further into patients by doing more testing is very relevant. I just to hook back to that comment came out of, we were talking about DNA. I like if the patient has been with me for 5 or 6 sessions and they started to go beyond their initial reason for coming, and we're thinking about letting them go into the long term, and you're thinking, well, what is it I'm going to say to this person on the more or less last visit? And I like to offer them before that to do a good comprehensive DNA, because I can then target which of the areas in their system need that long-term support and try to drive it home. And we're talking really forever. You can't fix the genes, and they tend to manifest their problems more and more as you get older, so stick with it. So I do like to offer the DNA as at least the final kind of place to go.
It's a really good point, actually, and I think this really speaks to a broader trend within, I guess, health and personalised health in general, because we both attended a really interesting lecture, I think, last year, talking about using AI and personalised data to plug into basically a broader health outcome for people, in that they carry their personal data with them. They'll carry their genome on their phone, and then when they see a new healthcare practitioner, they'll be able to basically download all of this kind of personalized structural information to whoever they're seeing. And then we now, in 10 years, are able to allow an AI to basically, look at the molecular targets genetically for them. I mean, in some cases, and especially, big shout out to Peter Adamo, who's created pretty much one of the most amazing platforms I've ever seen in Datapunk. you're able to actually plug in someone's genome and say, okay, well, we have multiple options for TNF alpha, for example. But I think on the basis of your genome and what we're looking at, curcumin's going to be the best option out of those options for you and your health history, how we've seen your brain and all of these other things. And it's going to be a fascinating next 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, it would be good to talk about the DNA reports and the different ones and which ones, offer what and for what price
Right.
at some point. But just again to say, wow, to Pierre Adamo's work and the Opus 23, the DNA ones that can be provided through, I'll give a plug for Invivo, because they do a lot of good testing for us, don't they, here in Hong Kong.
That's right.
It can be done through them, and it's like after you're looking at 3,500 SNPs, it's got this pie chart of how important different nutrients could be for this patient.
Yeah.
And it's like, the width of each section of the pie gives you a good idea of how significant it is across multiple genes for this particular individual. And that's like, oh my God, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
It's like it's really taken a lot of the hard mental work out of the whole process.
Exactly. And, I think there's, in the broader elements of this as well, one of the interesting parts about this, and I'm not, whether or not you can comment on this, all of the successful CFS cases that I've seen over the years, or, one in particular that I think of, 10 years ago, they've all had to take the reins of their health. And you could probably say this for a broader sense in successful outcomes of people with chronic illness, but they've all had to take the reins at some stage and take a huge personal interest in their own health. And they've all had to actually take that interest to a next level where, like, okay, what responsibility as a patient can I have in that I know that, for example, these nutrients are something that I'm going to have to take personal responsibility in managing a level of consistency, for example, in that I'm going to take curcumin for a long time. I'm going to take B vitamins for a long time. And that actually now means that the relationship on this old relationship between the healthcare practitioner and the patient is actually changing, in that no longer is it a dictatorial kind of thing where it's like you do what I say, well, and that's it. But we now need to work together with our patients a lot more, because that kind of enrolment from the patient's point of view is actually really now going to be a game changer.
Yeah, the education side is really important. And the understanding of what particular individual support someone needs. And as you're saying, people are playing the patients are playing a very important role in that, giving you feedback and helping you determine exactly what they do need if you haven't got the data. For instance, just to give you an idea, curcumin doesn't do so well for me because I've got this MAOA like twist.
Sure.
And so
the same problem.
and it's like, okay, no, it doesn't actually help me too well, and it actually is something I've got to not do. So just as a kind of an idea of how useful this data gets to be down the track. Physicians know of it in relation to the CYP and how various of the drugs used overload certain CYPs, and then people have a fluctuating level of certain drugs as a result. The same idea with many of the SNPs, and there are the way to individualise eventually is to get that data, and it is kind of mind-boggling when patients wander in with a set of reports, and one of them is a DNA report, and they've given you a stool report and a this and the other. And it's like, okay, great, I know where we're up to, and see the big picture and see what's missing, and you can make big advances for people who've got all that data ready for you. It's nice.
It is nice. No, I'm hoping that, from a personal level, I'm hoping that we can nurture that a little bit more now, because one of the big things about natural medicine, the application of natural medicine, is that it takes time.
It takes time to learn. In this last decade, I mean, what's come along in the last decade?
No, it's
the
ridiculous.
Gut, SIBO, the microbiology, the microbiome, and all of the things. We knew the gut was critical in naturopathics forever, but we're doing much more sophisticated testing and treatments now. Another one would be the DNA example, methylation. All these things. We're just having to really learn a lot.
Right.
Anybody who's not learning a lot in their trade of being a physician at the moment is missing out on so many new ways to help their patients.
Indeed, yeah. And I think we've found that even with the CBD research, I mean, we've both been
Yeah.
kind of knee deep in that, and you kind of you walk around and go, oh, I've heard that these interleukins are directly affected. Then then you go to another study and they're like, well, hey, wait a minute, maybe it's from a different downstream thing. Then I think needs to be a level of humility at the moment in relation to what we do and don't know. But on the same hand, it does seem that post-COVID, we're going to be looking at some really new options for our patients. And like you said, that innovation is somewhat driven by us as practitioners, but actually may be driven more by our patients. And this is a really, really interesting kind of field.
For sure. Of course, there's a big range. So let's turn the topic again to the post-viral aspects and talk a little bit about the mitochondria. I think the topic's a bit too big to deal with totally today, but at least some broad concepts are important because the mitochondria being damaged is definitely a critical part of chronic fatigue. And one of the facets of that is that let's say there's a virus gotten into the cell and it's wanting to replicate itself. One of the things that our cells know how to do is to downregulate the production abilities of the RNA and the DNA so that the viruses in that sense can't reproduce so readily. And a lot of what's going on there is an initiation partly by the fact that there's electron steal is a term, and it's quite a neat term, that's going on with the viruses. The viruses are kind of hooking out NADH and NADPH and a couple of these critical vitamin-like things that actually feed into the electron transfer chain there in the mitochondria. So already their own activity is part of what shuts down the electron chain. But once that happens, then there's an oxidative effect because it basically got, through the effect of the electron steal, you've still got this oxidative process going on within the mitochondria. And that leads to consequences to do with assembly of the proteins. And you also get quite a lot of changes to the sulfur compounds so that the glutathione gets utilized, the methionine gets overutilized in the way that this oxidative effect works. So now you've got your methylation system is down, and you've got your energy production system down, and you've got your protein production system down. And the cell gets into this place where it goes into the cell danger response, and things can get stuck there and it doesn't know how to bring itself back. And that's the whole Navio theory of the cell danger response. And that does relate very closely into chronic fatigue syndrome. So for those physicians listening who are kind of going, this sounds pretty new, it's not exactly. 2014 that Navio published on this, and it's one of those things that's kind of having a slow explosion because it takes a little while to get. And the more you get it, the more you realize, wow, well, how do we correct this kind of stuck state that the cells get into when they've been chronically stressed within themselves, either by viruses? It happens differently with toxins, and we can maybe talk about that as another way that the mitochondria get damaged. But essentially, you've got this suboptimal function going on where you've got to find ways to generally kickstart it and reactivate those metabolisms again at the cellular level. And there are ways to do that.
One of the interesting things that I think, just to touch on your point about what's been changing over the last decade, is that I think we're actually getting science behind some of the more conceptual principles that we've seen within natural medicine practice. And you can say that there's somewhat of a running joke, but it's not really a joke because it's so real that everything starts in the gut for a natural medicine practitioner. And I don't think it ever will not be the case. But I think
there is a case for saying every patient who comes in should do a gut test.
Right. But I think the other interesting part about what you've been referring to with this hypo state, from the mitochondria, is that essentially that's our what would be a more physiologically oriented explanation for sickness behaviour. Mm-hmm. In that, we've known about sickness behaviour for a long time. In some cases, especially in my own practice, I've seen people who have been referred for depressive symptoms. Mm-hmm. And really, when you actually break it down, it looks a lot more like sickness behavior than it does depression, but it's very easy to differentiate, to kind of miss out on the differentiation between the two. But then now we can say, all right, well, if you've been experiencing some form of this kind of sickness behavior and you've got a hypo state, you're unable to somewhat activate the systems of your body. That can be activation in your immune system, that can be activation in a few things. The big thing here, more than anything, is that we may now have a somewhat of a biochemical idea of how to deal with that now, which is really, really exciting, right?
I think so. And again, you have to recognise that people who are coming at the chronic fatigue and the stress on the mitochondria from the mind actually need to include a definite 6-month program. The Gupta program is what I usually refer them to online, and they can buy the modules over 6 months and practice a way of recovery. And I think he's got something like an 80% response rate for CFS, for chronic fatigue. And of course, he'll draw the characters who recognise that stress is the biggest factor in their problem, which might be 40% of CFS sufferers, maybe 50%. But the Gupta program is something you might want to look at. It gives you a free month trial if you'd like to investigate it for your own personal use. But then there's this biochemic side. So I think before we sort of untangle that, and we might need to break this into a second session where we go into the detail of treatments.
Sure.
But to keep it more conceptual at the moment. But if we talk about the toxins side, so firstly our introduction to the topic today has been COVID and the way that the virus works within the cell is damaging. Let's just say it can lead to this affective post-viral syndrome. And this whole thing about the cell danger response is another way of describing that at the cellular level. But then outside of that, there's other ways that the mitochondria get affected. Mycotoxins or the organophosphates and organochlorine pesticides are a couple of significant ones, the dioxins. So what they do largely is they attack the cell membrane and the mitochondrial membrane as a tissue and oxidize it. And once that starts happening, you get the electrons running backwards through the electron transfer chain, and you stop getting the protons moving through those complex 1 and complex 2 and so on. And so you don't get the potential difference across that membrane, so you get less hydrogen able to come back down through the final complex 5. And so you get less ATP production. So a different way to get there, but, cases like that, the antioxidants and the things that actually correct the mitochondrial membrane are the most critical factors. People may not have even heard of acetylcholine, but you can test when you do certain tests. So I like to do the Great Plains Labs organic acid test. It's called an OAT test, OAT. And you can add on to that PLA2, phospholipase A2, for a little bit. Doesn't cost much. We only add an extra $300 and something onto the OAT test for our clients here at IMI. And, which is pretty much nothing in the cost of some of these tests, hey. So what that PLA2 is measuring is the inflammatory process, phospholipase A2. It's a phospholipid enzyme. It's breaking down the little tail off the phospholipid chains within the mitochondrial membrane so as to produce arachidonic acid, our dear old enemy, down into the leukotrienes and all of those nasties that are the pro-inflammatory triggers that go on further down the line to cytokine changes and so on. So when you are able to reduce that phospholipase A2 with acetylcholine is the number one way to go about that. You can get some effect with DHA from omega-3s too. But unless you're tackling that particular problem, the mitochondrial membrane can't repair itself. And you can't do it just with omega oils, although you can get a nice effect with krill oil, I find, because krill oil is still the omega-3 components, EPA and the DHA, are actually still attached to phospholipids. It basically sucks onto that mitochondrial membrane, providing the phospholipids and the anti-inflammatory factors. But you'll find you get a lot more bang for your buck when you throw in acetylcholine to that process, so that the PLA2 enzyme is reduced, which is one of the only things I know how acetylcholine, so what I'm trying to say is acetylcholine is one of the only things I know that does reduce PLA2. Berberine does too, by the way.
Talk to some of our listeners about how to identify whether, PLA2 as far as what you would think. So are we looking at metabolic syndrome? What are there any kind of indicators that you would think about when as far as how your patients might present in relation to PLA2?
Yeah, they're more cognitively affected.
Sure.
So the value of acetylcholine is it does cross the blood-brain barrier, as against phosphatidylcholine, which maybe some other time we can describe its value. But of course, it is a major nutrient in the cell membranes and in the mitochondrial membranes. That's phosphatidylcholine. Acetylcholine has the ability to also cross the blood-brain barrier and do membrane work in the brain. People who, let's put it this way, ADHD, autistics, all have a very high PLA2, and then you look at the Alzheimer's patients, the Parkinson's patients, also MS patients. So these highly inflammatory processes in the brain that have some benefit when you give omega-3s, you get more bang for your buck when you actually control the PLA2. Technically it's SPLA2, the one that's in the nervous system more. And the acetylcholine reduces that in the brain. So what people manifest as, coming back to symptoms, is they have a lot of the cognitive deficit. So if it's your grown-up patient who's been normal until they got the virus, they'll have a lot of cognitive deficit, can't concentrate, down moods, inability to plan, starting to have attentional type of issues, short-term attention span. And the tendency towards depression that comes along with any chronic inflammatory process in the brain. The schizophrenics and the psychotics also have very high PLA2. And one of the approaches for that is to give some acetylcholine.
Right.
Yeah. So
that's really interesting. I think we touched on glutathione actually off air, and I wanted to just bring that up before we finish this episode, because I think glutathione is probably my top 3 prescription.
Yeah.
It's getting close, aside from the B complex and magnesium. I mean, I'd probably have to fact check whether or not that's really the case, but it seems as if more and more where, me personally, I'm prescribing glutathione a lot. Do you think that's overprescribed? I think the reason why I'm leading you towards something is because we had an interesting conversation last week with some of the other practitioners here at IMI about potentially alternating NAC and glutathione. You touched earlier on this conversation about cysteine being a rate-limiting factor for glutathione production as well. What are we thinking, and what are your thoughts about glutathione and its use? As far as, is this something that we should now start to consider for a lot more people? Should it become foundational?
And what form? What form and for what?
Yeah.
For what individual? So firstly, glutathione is an amazing nutrient that, let's say we go back to the novel genetics on GSTM1, which 40% of people have. Well, they're not going to make enough. And then you've got your G6PDs don't make enough.
True. In
the red blood cells. So we've got a lot of people with a lack of it right from the start. Then you stick them into a polluted environment, which gobbles up a lot of it. So what do we do? So look, if it's a chemical exposure, and then you've got more of the mitochondrial membranes damaged, then the better form to be giving it is in the liposomal glutathione form.
Sure.
Because the liposomal form is fat soluble. It sticks again, like I was saying with krill, it sticks to the mitochondrial membranes and helps the repair there as it goes through into the intercellular compartments. Now, a lot of people are aware of glutathione being pre-digested if you eat it, and so there is one that's, I'm going to say the wrong name, there's a registered form by Sir Royal, is it? SER something is
Sertria?
Sertria, thanks.
Or Satir or something like that. It's Japanese.
Yeah,
The Japanese.
that's right.
Yeah.
And they've shown that it does raise their blood levels, but we've seen quite a lot of reports in the past that you eat your glutathione and you don't get your blood levels going up. And yet, the doctors who work with detoxification at a high level, like Dr. Ray in Texas back in those last few decades, they loved glutathione even as it was coming. So my presumption there is getting to the liver and doing some good things as far as at least the liver was concerned if it didn't get through to the blood. But when we come to one of the more recent forms of glutathione, the acetodenosine glutathione, that doesn't digest in the gut. And what they've shown with that that's a bit unique is it does get into the mitochondria. Now that's handy if somebody's got a virus.
Yeah, so really handy.
That's, and you can buy a formula from DFH with the N-acetylcysteine in there as well. Now my preference in most, because I have an emphasis in my practice at the moment for fixing up people with toxic load rather than viruses. So I'm tending to use their liposomal glutathione, 3 squirts twice a day. Now it's quite handy then if you do, because of whatever you're achieving with that glutathione in terms of chelation of toxins, to then have something that's going to help to take those toxins out. And look, I would say here at IMI we're still discovering what's the best way to bind the bile that toxin load is in. And there's no doubt that if you'd used an off-label use of cholestyramine, you get a good result. But cholestyramine does tend to create its own side effects, so not everybody likes it. But if you half-dose people, they still get a pretty good effect and not so much gut problems, and twice a day, about an hour after the meal. The other product that I'm beginning to experiment with now is the DFH product, Metal X Synergy. It's got a wide number of chelating agents, designed for metals more, but it's just as true that it binds a good number of things, and it's quite a wide variety of agents in it. So it's doing some good things in a broad pattern. And Phil, just to say one thing before about your proposal for glutathione. Paul Anderson, pretty famous in the naturopathic world, very well educated man, and with a lot of tough clients, and does do a lot of testing, so he sees what works and what doesn't. And he's got a kind of a thesis that goes, the antioxidant trio that are the primary antioxidants that are needed for long term, and at the start of treatments are always is the vitamin C, vitamin E, and glutathione. Now the vitamin C and E both play roles in recycling the glutathione. At some point you can look up a diagram on the antioxidant system, and you see there's lots of chain reactions in that system. And vitamin C and E do a lot to recycle glutathione. But then there's a bunch of other cofactors which, in his experience, if you are trying to detoxify somebody, especially if it's in the brain, then you have to use all of the cofactors as well. So what are they? That's magnesium, zinc, manganese, to some extent copper, although you've got to watch copper. And so vitamin B2, vitamin B3. So it gets complicated, but then sometimes somebody makes a nice formula that covers all the bases for you. And if we talk formula for a second there's one I like called Antioxidant Cell by Bioceuticals, and it's got also a lot of polyphenols from, there's a bit from grapeseed extract, and it's got the resveratrol, resveratrol too, which protect the cytochrome system quite well if you don't use excessive doses, which is a proviso that you need to pay attention to. So the dosage on Antioxidant Cell is 1 a day, and you can look at it and go, oh no, you can use 2 of that.
Yeah.
And what happens is complex 1 shuts down under the action of too much transresveratrol.
Yeah.
You can oxidize somebody. So just stick with the 1 a day if you do ever end up trying that formula. But it's a nice comprehensive formula because it has the cofactors, it has a bit of glutathione, it has some lipoic acid, it has the vitamin C, it has Annatto-E, you and I both know of Annatto-E, as a distinction, well, I should say tocotrienols, which is different to tocopherols. Okay, so we're talking about, there's 8 different types of vitamin E's, and 4 of them are called tocopherols, and the other one tocotrienols. Tocotrienols are better, and the delta, yeah, but so they're just basically more antioxidant in fatty tissue, which is critical for recovery of the mitochondrial membrane. So there you go. That's a fair bit of the ideas on the type of stuff you're going to have to look at when you're repairing mitochondria.
That's fantastic. And look, I think from this episode, we even mentioned this pre even starting to record this, that as we've been both looking into this deeper and deeper, and it does become more complex and more nuanced each time you revisit it seems, and there becomes more and more factors and more systems that we need to essentially accommodate for, or attenuate in a sense, in that we need to manage some of these functions before managing next.
And we haven't even talked about NRF2, right?
Well, cert 1, let's
getting their DNA itself to ramp up all the internal antioxidant levels.
I think, what, I want to send a big shout out to Amanda Archibald, because I think personally, if you haven't come across Amanda Archibald yet, the registered dietitian who's come up with culinary genomics, I think she's got the secret to that personally. Mm-hmm. But look, we're going to wrap this episode up. I'd like to thank you once again for coming in and offering some of your wisdom today. Now, if you are new to INL, you can visit inl.asia to get more information about what we do. We have many episodes of this podcast now. I believe this is now episode 11, so we're almost a teenager, and we're coming up to as much new content as we can. So do get in touch with us. You can sign up to the INL monthly newsletter on our website as well. And if you do love what Graeme has to say, there is a really cool email series that we've started called The Message from Graeme, where basically, it's some of your thoughts on paper in your inbox. So lucky you if you wanted to sign up for that. Now, we'll have a new episode coming up in June. So we're going to be doing this monthly. And if you do have any questions, get in touch with us on the website and we'll be able to help. But for today, thanks for listening. And once again, Graeme, thanks for being here. And we will see you all again next month.
Yeah, cheers, mate. Bye-bye.
The INL podcast is brought to you by Integrated Nutraceuticals Limited, Hong Kong. If you want to know more about INL, natural medicine, or how to unlock the potential of our range, simply go to www.inl.asia and sign up for our newsletter, or simply browse through our education section to see what you can find. We'll be back soon with another episode. Thanks for joining us.